evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Welcome to the second lecture of our 29th annual LA Day series. We are excited to have you all here and are looking forward to hearing from our speaker, Pamela Conrad. Before we begin, I'd like to make a quick mention about our upcoming lineup of speakers. Lisa Switkin was previously stated as presenting virtually on March 23rd. However, that day has been pushed back to April 12th at 5 p.m., still virtually. Our next speaker will then be Mara Rockcastle, who will be presenting in person on April 5th at 5 p.m. While Mara is presenting in person, the event will also be hosted virtually for those who are unable to make it. Now, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Colorado State University, CSU, the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, the Colorado chapter of ASLA, and the Student Colorado chapter of ASLA for helping us make this event possible. Introducing our speaker today is Jonathan Cable. Jonathan is a senior in the Landscape Architecture program at Colorado State University and is earning a minor in construction management. He enjoys taking every opportunity to serve the CSU community and currently holds the leadership positions in both CSU Ag Ambassadors and Presidential Ambassadors. As a Colorado native, his passion for building resilient communities has guided his work with the University of Colorado Denver's University Technical Assistance Program to provide solutions for rural Colorado communities. After graduating in May, Jonathan is excited to continue working with the College of Agricultural Sciences to spread the transformative work happening at CSU across Colorado. And now I'll pass it on to Jonathan.
Sounds great. Thank you, Anna. Good evening, everyone. I have the distinct privilege of introducing our presenter this evening, Ms. Pamela Conrad. Pamela Conrad is an ASLA lead AP in PLA, and she is the principal at CMG Landscape Architecture and founder of Climate Positive Design. Conrad focuses on climate mitigation and resilient design in the public realm. Her work is informed by a background in plant science and a passion for the environment rooted in growing up on a farm. She's an ASLA Climate Action Committee member, 2018-2019 Landscape Architecture Foundation Fellow for Innovation and Leadership, and recipient of the 2019 San Francisco Business Times NCRE Women of Influence Award. She has published numerous works and presented internationally for developing the Landscape Carbon Calculator Pathfinder app and Climate Positive Design Challenge. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Pamela. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and to everyone for the warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be spending this afternoon, evening with you, and I hope that this leads to some provocative conversation after I share my presentation with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Get us going. Okay, well, now Jonathan gave me a great introduction, but also wanted just to share a little bit more about myself and what drives me to the work that I'm doing today. As he mentioned, I grew up on a farm in Missouri, actually, so it's a small town, no town, actually, it was a farm. And it is where I connected with nature at a very early age, and ultimately is what led me to want to become a landscape architect and be involved in some of the issues that we're dealing with today related to climate change. And I left the farm and made my way to the big city in San Francisco, where I am principal at CMG Landscape Architecture. And our mission at CMG is to increase social and ecological well-being through artful design and advocacy. And over the past 8 or so years, I've had the privilege of working on some pretty significant projects in the San Francisco Bay Area. In particular, the Treasure Island redevelopment project, which is over 500-acre redevelopment in the middle of the San Francisco Bay, about 300 acres of parks and open space. And this project was the first project in the region that started the conversation about setting sea level rise adaptation guidance. And so as a landscape architect, it really became real for me. The place that I was working on was dealing with these issues and on an everyday basis. And since then, I've also spent the last almost 5 years on the San Francisco Waterfront Resilience Program, working with the Port of San Francisco, and Jacobs Engineering to address not only pending sea level rise that will be happening in the Bay Area, but also the earthquake risks that we face along the San Francisco waterfront, and enabling these challenges and risks that we have ahead of us, but the opportunity for those to make positive change in the communities surrounding the waterfront, and for those visitors that may frequent the Bay. And then beyond working on projects that are dealing with sea level rise, also shifting to projects that are specifically working on improving their carbon footprint. So the Atlanta Beltline project is a 300 miles loop around Atlanta that is improving mobility through a prior railroad corridor. So these days I'm really focusing on climate change in many different aspects. And for me, although I've been working in this space for quite a few years now, it hasn't been until the last couple that it started to personally affect me in my own lives. Here in the Bay Area, I've experienced flooding, fires that have led to conditions where we weren't supposed to go out in the day because the air quality was so bad. Also led to resource shortages, and then even actually displacement. And so it's real, and it's sometimes really scary. And so I think that for me, it's personally been helpful to educate myself and understanding what's going on, and to not let kind of being overwhelmed by the media or maybe experiences that I've had to keep me from getting involved in this space. And I think that there are organizations out there that help break it down for us to make it a little bit more accessible to understand how we as landscape architects can contribute not only to lessening the problems, but also coming up with solutions. And Architecture 2030 is a wonderful nonprofit organization that has developed this chart right here. And it helps us to understand what we need to do ahead of us. Right now, we have about a 340 gigaton carbon budget remaining to prevent a 1.5 degree Celsius temperature increase. And to prevent that from happening, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 65% by 2030. And we need to be at net zero emissions, or no, we're no longer emitting more than we're sequestering by the year 2040. And so it starts to make us realize it's not this very far off future for us. It's actually what we do in the next 10 and 20 years that is so critical to the future. And also understanding why that matters. It seems so unrelatable, 1.5 degrees Celsius, but when you start to get into the reports, what you can see is that actually it has real implications on humanity, our society, and that if we can stay within that 1.5 degree temperature threshold, we can prevent billions of people from being exposed to heat waves, millions of people experiencing hunger, and billions of people that won't have adequate water or be forced to migrate. And it's very sad that it's disproportionate to communities of color. And the reality is that those that have the least will be impacted the most. And then another kind of level of starting to understand why this matters to us is that understanding the impact of the urban built environment, in that is about equals about 75% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. And it's those greenhouse gas emissions that are causing temperatures to rise, reducing the air quality, increasing fires, and the seas to rise. And it's in those, that there's about 75% of that's from the urban built environment, and about 40% of that is coming from buildings themselves. But then about half of that, the other half, is coming from outside of the building. These emissions that are associated with the exterior built environment, places that we are part of creating, whether it be operational emissions through places that we design that require gas-powered equipment to operate, or fertilizers that we might use that include chemicals that contain greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide. There's also an embodied carbon value that is associated with the materials that we it naturally supports this photosynthesis, this opportunity to be part of the solution, to take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through the trees and plants through photosynthesis, and then sink them in the biomass themselves, whether it be in the tree wood or the leaves, or sinking that down into the roots below and into the soil carbon. It's this natural opportunity we have to sort of combat those emissions that we as a human species are contributing to. It's the natural carbon cycle. And while we've known generally as landscape architects that, we're practicing, best practices and thinking sustainably, ideas that there are ways that we can increase carbon sequestration, like green as much as possible through green roofs, or thinking about some of the plant choices that we make, like perhaps using more woody shrubs instead of lawn, or using plants that sequester more carbon rapidly, like bamboo, which is actually a grass. And then also just recognizing the importance of protecting and restoring our natural ecosystems like forests and coastal wetlands, seagrasses, and mangroves. Then there are also ways that we generally understood that we can reduce emissions through designing cities to be more walkable and more bikeable, minimizing soil disturbance, because every time we disturb the soil, that organic matter dies and then the carbon is released back up into the atmosphere. And then being thoughtful about the materials that we use, using local or reclaimed materials as much as possible, using cement substitutions in our concrete, which is the process that generates the most carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in that material itself. And then also looking at innovative ways to keep more carbon in the soil, like using the carbon-rich soil amendment called biochar. But although we kind of broadly understood these things, what I found was about 5 years ago that I, in thinking about sea level rise and all these things that we're doing, I started to ask myself, well, I wonder what the carbon footprint of my projects are, just out of curiosity. And so, that day I thought, oh, I'll probably go online, I'll probably download a tool or something, a calculator, and it's going to tell me, and then I'll be off with my merry way of my day. But what I found was that just didn't exist. There were plenty of tools out there to understand the carbon emissions of buildings. There were some that were really specific to maybe individual plant species, but there wasn't anything that told me what's this holistic carbon impact of the work that we're doing. And those are operational emissions, those embodied carbon emissions, that's carbon sequestration, and how does it relate to anything? And so it was really out of frustration and a little stubbornness, I think, that led me to start with a very crude Excel spreadsheet and pulling these data sources together to better understand that. And what I found was pretty shocking to me, actually. This is a couple acre park project, and of course, very sustainably minded. Couldn't imagine how it could be better. But the numbers in the lower left-hand corner in red are the metric tons of CO2 that's emitted by the project, and green is the amount of carbon that would be sequestered or taken out of the atmosphere through the trees and plants over its project lifespan of 50 years. And then the upper right-hand corner is the number of years it would have taken this project to offset its own carbon footprint. So that's sequestering now to sort of mitigate or offset the negative impacts that it had from its emissions. And I thought, well, that was quite a lot. 15 years seems like a long time to me. I never really thought that. But then what I realized was when I started to have those numbers and that information in front of me that, oh, well, I could have made a couple of design choices that would have actually made the carbon footprint a lot better. I could have substituted some of the paving materials with ones that had lower embodied carbon. I could have probably planted some more trees out there. If I would have converted some of the lawn area to shrubs. And thinking about, instead of using gas-powered maintenance equipment, we probably could have used electric in the operations and maintenance manual. And then looking kind of for some heavy hitters, the things you might not even think about that were below the ground, like some cellular concrete that we had to make some mounds. And so what I found was that, well, actually, if you look at the version before and version now, they look pretty much the same. They have the same programming. We didn't reduce them quality, but instead of it taking 15 years to offset that carbon footprint, it could have only taken 5. And the emissions were significantly less and sequestration significantly higher. And so I thought, well, I wonder if this is just a one-off or if it continues. And if I look at other projects. And so I went down this path of doing a lot of case studies to see, let's look at other kinds of projects. This was a half-acre plaza project. And if I was shocked by 15 years, I was definitely shocked by 194 years that this little project would take to offset its own carbon footprint. Again, it's a very small plaza, but obviously a lot of paving because this was, intended to host farmers markets and events and things like that. But again, that pattern reappeared. I could have made a few changes to my project, adding a few trees, getting rid of some of my site concrete and changing that to wood. Again, using some materials of lower embodied carbon, like stabilized decomposed granite instead of concrete, using cement substitutions in the site concrete. Instead of it taking 194 years to offset this project's carbon footprint, it could have been done in 20. And as you see, again, the quality hasn't been reduced, programming still remains the same. At the end of the day, it's just a little bit greener, but much better for the environment. And so I started to think, well, wow, that's pretty enlightening. But, that's great. If I change the way that I'm, designing things, that's not going to make that big of a difference. And, even if my firm's changing the way that we do things on all of our projects, still probably not going to make a dent in things. But what if we were to change our business as usual for the entire landscape architecture profession around the world? Would that add up to making a significant difference? And what I've found is that the graph on the left, our business as usual, how we're designing likely showing that we're probably emitting more carbon than we're sequestering on our projects, and quite a bit more. But by just making those simple changes in those case study projects, instead of being in the graph on the left, we can reverse the curve and be on the graph on the right-hand side. So not only could we potentially sequester more carbon than we're emitting by the year 2030, that we have an opportunity to take out upwards of a gigaton of CO2 out of the atmosphere by the year 2050, or we're hoping for even earlier maybe, and providing this unique climate positive contribution to the overall crisis that we have ahead of us. And so how to help us sort of deploy this, 2 years ago, I launched the Climate Positive Design Challenge. And what it does is it sets targets and guidance for designers to meet for their projects in terms of how many years it should take for their project to offset its own carbon footprint, for us to ultimately make this broader contribution of drawing down that gigaton of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so the targets are set as 5 years to positive for projects like parks or gardens, campus projects, hospitality, and 20 years for projects that are inherently a bit more urban, like streetscapes and plazas that tend to have more paving due to their programming. And so again, it's with a goal of us shifting our business as usual to make this overall positive contribution, not thinking that with this unique opportunity, getting to neutral is not enough, that our goal is to become climate positive as a profession. And so to meet the goals of this challenge, with the Landscape Architecture Foundation fellowship, I was able to develop and launch the Pathfinder app. And it was a wonderful opportunity within the fellowship time that I had a really group of honest fellows around me, for us to be sounding boards for each of our projects and our work. And, when I asked them, I said, well, what would it take for you to change how you were designing your projects? And they told me 3 things. They said, 1, it would have to be easy. 2, it would have to pretty seamlessly work into the existing workflow that we have. And 3, I would have to know that what I'm doing is making a difference. I would need to see some sort of feedback. And so the design of the app is based in that sort of nudge theory, supporting positive reinforcement for good choices. And so it's pretty simple. There are basically 3 different elements that you input, your materials, or your plants, or your maintenance, and you're inputting your just general quantities. And so plugging those in, you either get a red number for emissions, a green number for the amount of carbon you're sequestering, and then at all times you're getting an updated live years to positive score. So you can see how that one change you just made has either a positive or a negative difference impact on your overall score. So I'm going to just jump in and do a little demo here, and hopefully the internet speed is working well for us. Just also the primary data sets for the app are coming from US Forest Service for sequestration data, and then the Athena Impact Estimator for much of the material carbon quantities. And so you'll be able to access the app through the Climate Positive Design website. So that's climatepositivedesign.com. And I'm going to walk you through just a few of the resources on here so you have them, you know where to look for them later if you come back to the site. So first off, we'll just go to the resources tab. And if you scroll down, a couple of things, there's a data report here, so you can download a PDF and peruse through that if you like, just to better understand like how are we doing the metrics, where the data source is coming from, things like that. There's the case study tab. So similar to those couple case studies that I showed you, there's a number of other ones on here. And so what you can do is, use the slider to see this was the design as it was originally conceived, and then what are the changes and ultimate impacts that could have been applied. So there's a number of those here you can take a look at. And then the third one is there's a design toolkit. And so sometimes this is kind of a handy reference just to have sort of like main ideas of best practices in terms of, okay, what am I looking for? I'm designing a pathway. What's a low carbon alternative? Maybe I want to look at some planting strategies to think about. Here's basically, a list. You can download this PDF, have it at your desk for maybe a project that you're working on, just have a quick reference. And, it's still evolving, but the intent is to also not only talk about the carbon benefits, but then also getting into what are some of the other co-benefits that are associated with this strategy, whether it be water use reduction or biodiversity, things like that. And so you can access and download that here. And then there's a number of additional resources to check out as well. And then on the challenge tab, just in case you're wanting to know and reference the challenge targets at a later date. Those are listed here along with what we're trying to accomplish. The overall stats show up live here. And then there is a project map that shows all the projects in the world that have been logged. It's having a little slow loading. And then anyone who logs a project, including students, gets recognized on the website here. So what we're trying to do is for positive reinforcement, acknowledge everybody that's even making an effort to think about this. And so feel free to come back and check that out. All right, so then third tab we'll go to on the website is the Pathfinder app itself. It's under the Calculate tab. And so if this is your first time using it, you can just click Use Pathfinder and it will launch into the app. And so this is just a little intro. If it's your first time, you can skip this the next time you come back to it. But what it does is just explains the kind of basic premise of what is climate positive design. These two factors that we're looking at, carbon sequestered, carbon emitted, and then this direct relationship between the two and how long it takes your project to be climate positive and offset that impact. So, and the relationship between the two is that the more carbon that we emit on our project, the longer it's going to take them to offset, and that the more carbon that we sequester, the less time it's going to take, and the direct relationship between those two things. And then you just hit the checkbox to move forward. The second step is to locate your site. I'm just going to go somewhere close to me here. That will be the fastest. But anywhere in the world, you can type in your address or zoom around the map to find your site that you're working on. And I'm just going to go to this park, and I'm going to pretend that maybe we're going to do maybe I have to do a renovation of this park project. Maybe there's some opportunity for water use reduction or native planting, maybe some lawn growth or something like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and define my site boundary, saying that it's this entirety of this project. So you just draw a polygon around. And once you got it, you just hit the check mark, and this works for you. Great, you can always refine it if you like. And then we're going to go ahead and use this. You just have to have an email to have an account and sign in. It's free, so anybody can use it, and students are definitely encouraged. So we'll just go ahead and type in the name, some basic parameters. We'll just say water use reduction, give it a category for a type of project. If you know it, the estimated completion date here. You can toggle between your units that you'd like to use, give a parameter of what kind of phase you're in, what project you're working on, if you're pursuing any of these different certifications. And then this is an important one for you, for all the students. If this is a academic study project or something that's not anticipated to be built, go ahead and check this box, and it'll be excluded from the overall professional contributions. But again, that's there to encourage all of you to use it. This is for you. So, and then you hit create project, and you can select between an existing condition if you want to understand how an existing site is performing, or if this is design alternative. We'll go ahead and say that this is a design alternative. And we'll just say, I don't know, option 1, 50% water reduction. Okay, and then hit create. And as I showed in the earlier, this is a little tooltip to get you started. So how you get started is I'm just adding any materials, and you can either search for those in the drop down or in the search, or you can use the drop down category. So you'll see here, like I was just showing you in the slide, the 3 tabs: materials, plants, and operations. All the references are listed here in case you'd like to check those out. And so let's just imagine in this renovation project, maybe we're going to add, need to add maybe a path or something to get us through this native planting area. So you just go ahead and select any of these materials here. We'll just go ahead and say that we're going to make this a standard concrete pathway to get started. And what happens is once you select it, it pops over to the right, and all you need to do is give some basic dimensions on kind of what the area is of the material that you're using. So we'll just say that this is 1,000 square feet of our concrete, give it a depth, and you see the red number that pops up, and that is the amount of embodied carbon emissions from the transportation, extraction, manufacturing of an installation of that concrete, 1,000 square foot of concrete. So now you are on your way. You can keep adding, let's say, I don't know, maybe we are, the general kind of materials are all in here. Maybe we also have some asphalt areas. So you can add those in here. And just, keep going. Let's see, we'll add some different types of things. Maybe we have to add some walls and the loop headers maybe. So we'll add those in. And if you don't like the dimensions, just hit switch and you can kind of get yourself to something that you are more familiar with. So you can see this is a tricky one. And, okay. All right, so you just keep going through this process. I'm going to go add in just a couple more things here for us, just so we can get some outputs the way that we might want them. We'll just go ahead and say, how about concrete sidewall? And parameters to these again. Okay. All right, so once you've got your materials in, and again, you know, there's kind of a wide range of categories all the way down to things like, you know, even the difference of using gravel mulch or organic mulch, you know, so just don't, I think that one thing when learning, you know, doing this process is that to not let perfection be the enemy. You're not going to have everything in your all their quantities in a really early design stage, but it's important just to get started as soon as you can in the process, because it's earlier to make big changes. It's easier to make big changes earlier on in the process. And then the second step is that you'll get to your plants tab. And what you can see here is that there's a drop down that includes trees, shrubs, lawns, perennials, wetlands, natural forests, so kind of general categories. And you can go ahead and get started. I'll just start by plugging in some trees here. So maybe you've got some deciduous medium-sized trees. What you want to go ahead and do is the sequestration data is geographically specific, because we know that in areas where there are more growth days per year, those plants sequester more carbon over a year's time. And so you want to go ahead and make sure that you're kind of in the right zone for your project. We're actually in the southern growth zone here in California. And then all you need to do is to start plugging in your quantities of trees. And so then two things just happened there. One, the green number that pops up is the amount that you're going, those 50 trees are going to sequester or take out of the atmosphere over their 50-year lifespan in your park project. And then the second thing that happened is that you now have a years to positive score. So it's showing that it will take those trees 10 years to offset that concrete and curb and things that we just entered in our materials. It also tells you that it's going to take, you're not quite there yet. Your goal is to get to, offsetting that in 5 years. And so it's going to continue reminding you of that through that process. You can also then keep cruising through. You can start giving area for shrub planting, toggle basic kind of parameters, and then just keep adding. And then again, so it keeps following suit here. You see your shrubs pop up and your years to positive score update with the amount of carbon that those shrubs are sequestering. So you just keep going through that process. And the last tab I'll show you is the operations tab, where you can find things like what kind of equipment are you using? Is it gas powered or is it electric? Do you have to do some grading on site? Where you're going to be disturbing the soil. And so you want to say, you know, if this is part of like minimal regrading, or if you're doing more significant work. Also want to account for things like if we have to do any demolition as well. So if we're tearing out an area of asphalt to put planting in, we still want to make sure that we're accounting for that. And so you just go ahead and here again, plug it in and give it some basic numbers, and it starts to show up again. So you just build this through your project. I think, you know, just it helps just to spend a little time kind of going through here to see what's in each category. And then, once as you're going along, you start to see these other kind of stats populating how your project ranks and the overall, all the projects that we have in the database so far. What's its overall impact in terms of how much carbon you're sequestering beyond emissions. And then there's a couple other things. Once you've gotten sort of the basic level of information in here, you can drop down this version stats and you can view your project scorecard. And so what this does is just gives you a snapshot of all those things that we just entered, kind of summarizing them for you, and then some helpful charts that start breaking it down, what we just plugged in. So right here, for example, in your emissions, we can see that what I just entered in our terms of our project emissions, that paving was 92% of the overall emissions of those things that we just plugged in. So for me, that would be an indication of, okay, that's the first thing I need to figure out how to change. And then the other ones you can also start, thinking about, do you have other substitutions for making those, changes? Do you have other options? On the second page of the scorecard, you can see it's just a list of all of these elements that you've input. And then at the bottom, this design suggestions tab, you can pop that open. If you need a little bit of guidance, like, well, where do I start with making things better? So you can start to look at, for that pedestrian concrete that we entered in here, it summarizes your emissions for you. And then with the drop down, it starts to give you a list of different alternatives to consider that would have a lower amount of embodied carbon. And so even just notably, you could use pedestrian concrete with cement substitutions, and that would be better. And so it's kind of helping you get a sense of where you go from there. You can obviously also just then go in, add that pedestrian concrete with cement substitutions, and you can start to see them side by side, how much better is one versus the other. So that is, that's kind of the tour. And it's, from here, you can change anything that we just input, change a picture, delete it, change some of these parameters that maybe you didn't know when you started it. It's all pretty editable. Then, viewing your scorecard, you can also duplicate the option that you just created. So if you want to just say, okay, well, I want to just test something out and see if I made a couple changes and I can compare them. So you can do that as well. And you can do that against an existing condition as well. And so then, if you have like one account for your studio, you could set up one account, you can all use it, and that way you could all see your projects in here together. We do this for our firm, so we can come back in here and see how is everybody doing on their projects, and you can easily come back to them and edit at any point in time. So that's the tour, and then I'm going to just share a little bit more with you, and then we'll kind of wrap things up here and have some conversation. But just to summarize, now through going through those case studies, really starting to better understand the changes that we can make. There's actually really kind of 5 key things to remember on what you can do. The first one is to maximize planting, increase it as much as you can, so that we're increasing the carbon that's stored in the plants and in the soil. To minimize hardscape as much as possible, using lower carbon alternatives. And there's a number of listed here. Minimizing and recycled, making sure that we're smart about our material selection, making sure that we're using the maximum amount of recycled content, and using as many local materials as we possibly can. And then the last 2 are really thinking about, well, you've gone through this trouble to make all of these smart design choices to make sure that that intention carries forward into the construction and then even beyond, after we as designers step away from a project, that those best practices can continue through the maintenance and operations stages of that project's life. And so if you remember anything, those are the top 5 to keep in mind as you're designing going forward. And why we do this, why we measure is ultimately because it creates a feedback loop for us. by reducing our emissions and increasing carbon sequestration and being thoughtful about how we do it, that can change and inform how we design going forward. We can evolve as how we practice and make standards and different ways of doing things that are in a more climate positive way. We can advocate for new policies, new curriculums, site standards, accreditations when we have this knowledge with us. And then we can also educate and communicate differently going forward and better preparing the next generation of landscape architects. And so, it's with this feedback loop that we can ultimately evolve as a profession and a society. And so as I mentioned, this effort initiative I launched about 2 years ago, and everyone always asks, how's it going? And, with no expectations at the beginning of this, it's pretty wonderful to see how many people are stepping up, just using the website resources in general, the broad reach around the world. That just shows how many people want to get involved and make a difference. So it's great to see that we have several thousand projects logged, and wonderful there, almost 400 universities have been using the resources, which is really amazing, and logging projects. And then just in general, how much we've been able to increase awareness. And it's also now allowing us to be a part of this larger global conversation that's happening about what are the different solutions out there where we can overall contribute to a positive drawdown, ultimately with the goal of reversing global warming. And so with those projects, we can now understand, how many millions of trees that we're planning to plant through our work. And then how that translates into how much we're going to sequester beyond our emissions. And then what trying to do is break it down in ways that will be accessible to people. So it's that amount of carbon that will essentially be the equivalent of taking almost 400,000 cars off the road by the year 2040, or almost 1 million cars off the road by the year 2050. And just to kind of make it more relatable in how we might think about things on a daily basis. And then it's also understanding who's getting involved and where they are around the world. We're also able to start seeing some key trends and findings from these projects that are logged, and understanding that about 75% of our overall emissions are coming from our materials. And so that's really an incredible opportunity for us to work with manufacturers, to be more mindful of designers and the materials that we're specifying, being inquisitive about how they're made and understand their carbon footprint. So that's something that we know that we have to tackle, and we are doing it right now, where I'm working closely with manufacturers to change those things. And it's also, just in recognition that while we see that we are increasing planting and how much we're sequestering per square foot, there will be a max, there will be a limit to that amount. And so we also have to be reducing our overall emissions. Again, it's about finding that balance. And it's also been wonderful to see these approaches being implemented around the world by lots of different people, landscape architects that have been getting involved. This is a project of April Phillips here in California for the Center for Food and Agriculture Marin Farmers Market, a project that has been recognized and acknowledged by their local drawdown marin, I guess it's that action plan. And that project is 2 years positive. They have a really incredible approach to how they're designing and specifying their concrete in that project. And at CMG, we are, this is a project in Alameda called Alameda Point Deep Pave Park, where it's a former naval base, and we're proposing to remove and repurpose all of the material on site and transform that into future ecological intertidal habitat. And for us, we're really looking at this as an opportunity to redefine resilience, not one that is just adapting and accepting the changes of climate change, but one that is being proactive and also drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. And that project is at 4 years positive, and I'm so excited it's been recently funded and it's going to move forward. We have, even through the pandemic, still been connecting with community members, whether it was online or on the site safely, to have a conversation about this site and how it could better serve their community, which is an underserved area of need. And we're also thinking about, obviously, this coastal project, how it will be originally designed to bring people out to the water's edge, creating much needed and threatened habitat, and recognize that it is going to change over time and planning for that change. We can start to understand that by what it will be like perhaps day one in terms of the species that will be there, the carbon that it's sequestering, how it's accessed, and then over time how that's going to change with sea level rise, and being thoughtful and intentional about how that's going to happen. This is a project out of the folks from Planet IE in the UK, and they've shared with us that it was an interesting process for them to go through and with their client, and recognizing they had a moment of finding out that traditional approaches weren't going to meet the targets. And so this, using the tool and the process, was a way for them to have a conversation with their client. And it actually changed the client's preconceptions, and they adjusted their design of this open space to become 8 years to positive. And not only did they do it on a site-specific scale, they also scaled it up to be a precedent for the entire regional parks system. And so you can see how they've started to break down the approach in all these different open spaces and how they're stacking up to their carbon targets. This is a wonderful project in Spain by Space Coop, and they talked about some of their strategies included not only maximizing carbon sequestration, but thinking about how they were using drought tolerant adapted plant species and permeable paving materials to address the water shortage crisis as well. And then I think it's also important for this conversation to be very honest and recognizing that not all of our projects are going to meet these targets. This is our goals, these are aspirations. We have to think about it as a global profession and how we're working together. This is a project out of Seattle that's obviously over 1,000 years to positive, which happens, but they still, even with that final outcome, they spoke of the importance of having this conversation with their client early on. And it also raises for us that we might not always be able to offset our carbon footprint on sites. We might still have to think about offsets in other ways, whether it's making donations to support forest protection or conservation or restoration in other parts of the world, or wetlands for that matter. So I think what it's doing is allowing us to take a look in the mirror, see how we're doing, and then we can react based on that. Was also contributed to a recent development of a sites carbon credit, which is very exciting to see these certification systems change. And then last year, not just keeping this to ourselves, there's an importance of going beyond just landscape architecture, starting to work with other disciplines. And so for part of the landscape architecture community, we had a global initiative that drafted up the International Federation of Landscape Architects Climate Action Commitment this past year. And in a collaboration with Architecture 2030, so again, the enhancing the multidisciplinary aspect of this, teaming up together and taking a united built environment message up to COP26, which is the United Nations Conference on Climate Change. So it's where the biggest decisions on climate change happen every year with our world leaders. And so we're proud to have been, this has been the first opportunity that landscape architects were at that kind of global stage and making that statement. And it's a starting point, but we've got to start somewhere. And then I think, just kind of going back to the beginning of why we're doing this. At the end of the day, why make climate positive landscapes? It's because, ultimately our goal is to help these communities that are most vulnerable to the risks going, ahead of us. And we, by reducing our emissions and increasing sequestration, we have an opportunity to support all these other co-benefits that are associated with those smart changes. And so important for us to keep in mind and motivate us to keep going with keeping these things in mind. There's tons of ways that anybody can get involved. And so I encourage you, students, for you to use this in your projects. I think for professors, for academics to think about how this can be integrated into your educational curriculum. I know we've worked on supporting the development of that in schools, and also changing licensure standards so that that it's becoming a standard for landscape architects to be versed in this conversation. There's lots of other ways also to get involved, but feel free to reach out through the website that's shown here, or happy to talk about other questions that you might have. And I just encourage you all to get involved if you're interested. We could use your help. So thank you very much. That's the end of my slideshow.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pamela. We really appreciate the time that you were able to share with us this evening, and also just sharing about the Pathfinder app. I think it's so cool. I got to mess around with it a little bit yesterday in studio and found it so practical and easy to use. So I love that about it. Folks, remember to keep sending in your questions. And before I get to the ones that my team has prepared, I'm going to ask a couple that I was thinking of during your presentation. And one of those is cost, and thinking about climate positive design. And I know that cost can be a big barrier, especially when talking to clients about new ideas and new solutions. So in addition to cost, what other barriers have you seen when talking to clients about climate positive design? And how do you see that conversation changing as climate positive design and other design solutions like it come more mainstream?
Yeah, excellent questions. So, I mean, and of course, cost is always at the top of the list. But the good news is that if you were to take, 1 square foot and you were to pave it versus to plant it, it's a significant cost savings. And so that it's about the most straightforward thing that you can, in terms of thinking about costs, is it's actually cheaper to approach a project with a climate positive design perspective. In terms of just looking at sheer square footage, or what is your sort of percentage of your project in terms of paving and versus planting. So that's kind of a really easy way to think about it. If you can just shoot for a higher percentage of planted versus a higher percentage of paved, you're going to have cost savings ultimately. But then when it comes down to it, obviously, plants need water, right? And in many places we're going to be experiencing drought, water shortages. And so we can't just go out there and plant a bunch of water intensive lawns, right? We have to think about, all these aspects of it. But if we are thoughtful about the planting approach, if it's native plants or drought tolerant planting, then those plants, communities, native plants, once they're established, oftentimes they don't actually need irrigation added to them, right? And so they have lower maintenance because they actually meant to thrive in that environment. And so you can start to go through some of the trade-offs, but then you realize there are a number of ways to approach it and start to think about the other questions. Planting also comes with maintenance as well, but again, that's where you can go, well, can we do something that's a little bit more low maintenance? Can we have more of a native landscape that doesn't want to be pruned into a ball, and it doesn't need a gas power, hedger to make that form, right? And so, in some ways it's really, I think, almost like returning to nature, looking at the beauty of nature and how resilient it is in terms of our approaches. And I have to say that, maybe I'm lucky from where I'm located here, but clients are generally very, very supportive and constructive in this process. And if they're not, getting to this point in time where they're actually asking for it on their projects. And so whether they're familiar with climate positive design or not, or whether they just know that climate change is a big issue and they want to know what to do it, how to address it on their project. That I think that is that's the good news, is there are a lot of people that care and they want to be making these climate smart choices in their projects. And so honestly, not finding a lot of resistance, especially when you can tell them that it's not a cost increase. I would say if you're going out and using some fancy new material, you obviously have to look at that. If it's carbon sequestering concrete, right, there are some of those materials that have a markup or a premium on them, but honestly, using cement substitutions in concrete, even doing lots of different batches. So where you have, certain type of concrete that's got this strength or this cure time until it dries, and you want to have lots of different options on your site to essentially, reduce the carbon footprint of those, that we've actually found that there's a net zero cost at. So it's not going to cost anymore. It may cost, a little bit more time for you as the designer to be thoughtful about what that approach is, but it actually, it's definitely doable. We're implementing it right now in projects. So those are kind of the ones that come top of mind. I'm sure I can come up with more.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Deeper.
I guess too, to bounce off of that question of materials and looking at different materials and doing more research into lower carbon materials. We did have a question that was asked about, especially with concrete, looking at lower carbon concrete and different solutions for that. What products have you found that are helpful with that?
So we found the best luck with is that it's kind of a full recipe that you're looking at. So you're looking at cement substitutions first. So there's a number of cement substitutions out there. So slag, fly ash, silica fume, and there's hemp, there's a lot of new cement stuff. So starting with that first, and you can typically get at least like 50% cement substitutions approved. You can also use carbon cure, which I recommend checking out, and that that's okay, take a look at that. And then there's also carbon sequestering aggregates as well. I think Blue Planet is one of those. I don't know if I'm actually supposed to be saying product names as well in these things, but so when you start to look at it, it's a kind of a combination of a number of the recipe that's going to come together in your concrete, basically.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And I have actually, it was a really great presentation at the last ASLA conference. The woman that was in charge of the LinkedIn campus, all their new construction, she's grew up with a concrete family, and so it's like her thing on these job sites, and they've actually been able to come up with carbon neutral concrete again, and that's the same. It's the same, like coming up with the right formula and testing it out, but that's, if it's not there for widespread use, it's very, very close. And so that'll be huge for us.
Cool. And I guess also another question, looking at materials and even plant-based materials as substitutes for building products. Have you seen any research into potentially using things like fungi for bricks or anything like that? I know you mentioned bamboo alternatives and things like that.
Yeah, I have a slide. I don't know if I need to pull it up or not, but actually I will just pull this up because it's easy if people don't. It's hard to remember these names, so I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Which lists a few of these. And I would say that in terms of, so here's some alternatives that are just listed here to check out. A lot of these aren't, being in full widespread use at this point in time, but like you said, I think one of these was anyway, yeah, bacteria, mycelium, hemp cork, all kinds of crazy things coming out. And it's, they're relatively, new to the market. And so those are, again, probably could be some that are going to be a little bit more expensive. But here's another, just another list of alternatives to pavers that are coming out of BioBrick. I think that is one of the ones that's using the bacteria mycelium. There's an installation here in San Francisco of that. So it's, it's out there. Hempcrete, corkcrete, even like wood timbercrete is where they're using wood particles and making this, kind of bricks and decking. And interesting to check that out. So there's a number of things out there worth checking out. But I think one thing that's really interesting is actually how the architecture industry is changing in terms of using mass timber in buildings as opposed to steel. I think for architecture industry, I think 80% of their emissions are coming from concrete and steel, just two materials alone. And so, so they're really looking for replacements, and mass timber, using wood, even sawdust that's been compressed to make super strong wood that can be used even in skyscrapers. It's pretty amazing. So we're coming around.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, and I guess another question about using alternative materials and resources. Are there any, I guess, issues that you've seen with various coding or various codes, I guess, in cities that have to deal with implementing these new materials to see, if they'd actually be safe for the community, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, they all have to go through the standard, approvals process, right, which takes time. So as much as we want all these things right now, they all have to go through certifications and be, and meet all the rating criteria. But it's shifting pretty quickly. We're using cement substitutions and carbon cure and the carbon sequestering aggregates here in the Bay Area. And I know that in working on the Atlanta Beltline project, there was an example of different ownership had kind of their different standards of what their concrete could have. And so there, was, okay, well, it could be acceptable by this jurisdiction, but not this jurisdiction. And so we all went through a pretty intensive process to say that, like, look, it's installed over here and we can meet all of these, we can show that it's meeting all these tests and everything else. And actually, I think a huge win is that they're now, and it's kind of like the Department of Transportation, right? It's just pretty major in terms of like, what levels do you need to get those approvals, but it's becoming more commonplace. So it's not as difficult as it was at one point in time.
Cool. So another question that came up too, as you were presenting and being LEED certified as well. A question that I had is looking at the various ways that you can get LEED credits. Do you foresee, or is it already commonplace to look at this type of technology use and potentially get a LEED credit for implementing this type of technology in the design process?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that there's a new site credit out. There's also a new LEED credit as well that I helped them develop. So yes, it is because I think they're both in pilot credit stage right now, but yeah, it's becoming adopted.
That's awesome. Very good. And then I guess too, with developing this whole technology, what was that learning curve like, if you could explain it, from going from, like soil research to then landscape architecture and design, and then into the whole technology realm? What was that learning curve like for you?
Pretty steep. but I mean, I have to do full disclosure, I have no tech background at all. I am not a tech person. I don't have a Twitter account. Sadly, you can't communicate with me that way. But I think there is a learning curve in terms of pushing myself just to like the curiosity, and I don't know, recognizing, like, using my frustration to do something with it, as opposed to just being frustrated and then saying like, oh, well, somebody else will do it, because the reality is just nobody was doing it. And so I think that that's just maybe just encouragement for all of you, as students coming out into the field, is that, sometimes you're not always going to find all the answers, and we need more, we need more people questioning, status quo and thinking about things differently. I don't know any other really, like, this wasn't like a typical path, but it just seemed to be, there was a gap that somebody needed to fill, and just kind of out of my own passion, I'm still going. But I also recognize my limitations. I think that that's another important aspect too. I am not the coder. I don't even know all the right terminology. I know enough terminology to be dangerous, but I also recognize that there are others out there that are super skilled at building tech. That's what they do. They're trained for that. And so I think more importantly, like partnering with people that are, equally passionate, but also have a different skill set, right? And working with people that are different than you. And it's been really incredible, actually. Like my app developers have been in Australia and the UK, web developers in Australia, also people that I've been working with over the past year all around the world. And it's of course tricky sometimes in terms of like time zones and things like that, but I think it makes like the ultimate, at the end of the day, it makes it much more rich when we're all kind of bringing different perspectives to what we're doing.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. So just got another question. So could you share a location where students can find resources that provide carbon statistics on the best vegetation to use? So I know a question that I got to during this evening was, if trees work better than grass, work better than shrubs, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, iTree and the U.S. Forest Service is probably the best resource that's out there that exists. And at least, when I kind of started this, it was pretty limited in terms of, I think, just trees at that point in time. They're working kind of to expand that data. And, I think when it comes down to it, there's a couple simple terms to think about. That carbon storage is directly related to biomass. So if you look out your window and you see there's a little tiny redbud tree and then there's a huge oak, right? The amount of carbon stored in that huge oak is so much more significant than the little tiny redbud tree. It is a condition, a relationship where scale matters, honestly, and is really great if that oak tree is going to live also for a really long time, right? It is about the biomass, the amount of wood in its tree trunk, its root system. There's a direct relationship to that. And, about 80% of the carbon that's sequestered by the tree is going to be held in its above ground biomass. And then the other 20 is going to be within its roots and, extracted into the soil below. So that's one thing to think about just in terms of how it relates to scale and vegetation. It's a little bit different when you start to think about whole ecosystems. Like if, for example, if you were to think about a savanna, or a full like grassland, I mean, because those ecosystems, they are, capturing carbon from the atmosphere, the grasses, and because they're not getting mowed and they're not releasing a lot of that carbon back to the atmosphere because those blades otherwise, fall off, they die, and then that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere. When it's a natural kind of grassland ecosystem, most of that carbon, goes down into their root systems, a really dense, ecosystem that's below ground, right? And so that's very extensive. And so it's a little bit different when you start to think about, that at kind of like an ecosystem scale, because that is where those ecosystems, can be different than you might expect versus like more kind of an urban planting condition. It was interesting to look at wetlands, our blue carbon ecosystems. I think they store about 5 times the amount than tropical rainforests. So it's also different when there's water involved, right? When you have, that kind of relationship, because without the presence of water, that carbon can really be stored in a significant quantity, below the Earth's surface in a kind of like wetland blue carbon ecosystem condition. So anyway. I recommend the resource drawdown. If anyone's not familiar with it, it's really great for helping you break down and understand all the different strategies for the overall kind of drawdown that we need to accomplish.
That's great. And so I guess we've been looking kind of at the very smaller details of the app and the work that you're doing. So I guess now speaking on a broader scale of landscape architecture, what excites you the most about the future of the field of landscape architecture?
Well, I think it's that obviously I have a passion for what's happening in the world right now. And I think that we are just so uniquely positioned to be leaders in this solving this challenge that we have ahead of us. It's in our toolkit. These strategies that we have, we're so well equipped, not only from our everyday medium that we work with, but also our ability to communicate. And that has been such a challenge. Honestly, where we are right now is that people haven't been able to communicate the challenges that I have, and also the solutions that are possible. So I think it's just such an important opportunity for our profession to step up and into. The world needs us more than ever right now. So I really feel like it's a great time to be a landscape architect.
Yeah, for sure. And as as a senior in landscape architecture right now, and to the rest of the students, what advice do you have for specific skills that we should be looking at as we implement new technologies into the field?
Well, I could probably give you the easy answer in response to that, but I won't, because I actually think it's technologies and tools that we don't even know about yet that we need you to bring. And so I think my suggestion is to ask a lot of questions, and when you don't get answers, figure out a way to make it happen and do it, because that's where we're really gonna be game changers.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. That's so cool. Cool. And so I guess back to the work that you've done, and your progression through all of this, and how with the fellowship has challenged you, and coming out of that with this new project in this product. I guess, what would you say was one of the biggest things in your own mind, or one of the biggest barriers that you had to overcome in this whole process?
Yeah, I think I would go back to that, not letting perfection be the enemy of progress, because I mean, I will be the first to say that the app is not perfect, the website's not perfect, the projects aren't perfect, they're just not. And nobody that's in this space of like resilience and climate change, I mean, frankly, like, okay, we're getting a little bit better of knowing what we're doing, but this is unknown territory. And so if you have to be comfortable with the unknown, and you have to accept the knowledge and the information that you have has to be enough to move forward, because if you don't, you're going to have a really hard time. And frankly, like, we're kind of running out of time on some of these challenges that we have. So be good to just kind of do your best and keep moving forward, I think.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's great. So we got another question in the chat. And the question is, how has the history of the projects in the office developed over time, based on these topics, such as the project with Treasure Island?
Yeah, so it's now, I think just broadly, we did start working on Treasure Island about 20 years ago. So that conversation about sea level rise adaptation has been happening for a while in the Bay Area. It has been shifting in our projects and in Treasure Island as it's being constructed right now, in terms of, shifting from just planning for sea level rise adaptation to being more thoughtful about our carbon footprint. And so, we're actively changing our specs and our concrete right now. This is sort of this kind of thing happened midstream of some of these projects. And so at this point in time, we're trying to implement everything we possibly can. And then the new projects, we're making it a new way of designing going forward. That's part of the whole process, right? So we're looking at all these things holistically in every step of the way.
That's great. And then I guess too, with not only the Pathfinder app as a resource, but how would you say that other offices can implement, I guess, climate positive design throughout the entire process of what they're looking at with any project?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that my recommendation would be to, again, start as early as possible, which I mean, even before you have the project. So it's talking to your client about it in the interview. It's putting it in your proposal, it's testing out in your office. So you're well versed in this conversation, you understand. And I think it's helpful to get to have that kind of expectation and level setting at that early stage. If there's a client that doesn't care about this, and they're not interested, and this is part of what we do. And so, I mean, frankly, it's probably just not somebody that we want to work with. And so I think just having those conversations really early is a good thing to do. And then again, it's this being every step along the way, right? After you finish, concept, or you're thinking about these best practices, implementing to the design, and then, once you get to a certain point, okay, let's do the check-in at concept design, do the takeoffs, do the see how you're doing in terms of your score, and then making adjustments. What can you change in the next step, right? And so I see it as like it's something you've got to do at every phase along the way, including in through construction administration. That things change in the field when they're getting built. And so if we don't have, the resources on hand to say, hey, this contractor can't find the cement substitution, they don't want to do it. Like, no, we need to do it. You got to work with them. So I think it's just really, it's a gap that we're, maybe like stormwater management 20 years ago, right? It always wasn't something that we were quantifying and measuring and documenting, right? And so it's like, I think it's just continuing like that kind of holistic approach to everything that we do.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess, would you say that then there's a lot of education then that has to go in with clients, in the early stages, and I guess at every single step of the process then too?
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing, actually, when you can, set this collective goal at the beginning of the process. It's pretty great to see that, like, people are funny, they like, we scorecard. I mean, it's like, we're like, we're not like little kids, but everybody wants to get the good score, right? And so when you have your client rooting for, okay, I've had clients say like, we want to be at 0. I'm like, okay, well, that's really hard, like day one, but when you have those, your clients as your champions, it's much easier to do what you want to do on the project. So if you have that conversation early, that it'll just help you out through the process.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, looking at not only having the years to net zero, but then also beyond that, helping to create something that's actually actively sequestering carbon and saying that it is, obviously climate positive. I think that's a larger concept that a lot of people need to think of is, going beyond just zero, and how can we actually create those positive number landscapes as well. So I guess too, one of the final questions that I have is, how do you see this app and how do you see this platform continuing to change over time and to continue to offer new solutions, new alternatives? Or do you think it's set in place for, a few years, and then hopefully we'll release some new added features later on? Or
well, we'll see how things go. I mean, what I hear from people is that on one hand, this is still a really new topic to a lot of people. And so having some, kind of the app in its current state where it's pretty accessible, it's not too detailed to be cumbersome, it's giving a lot of people, a way to get in the conversation with a very low barrier to entry, a learning curve. So that accessibility is really important, and also that it's set up to be something that people can use around the world, ideally, is really important, I think, to the, kind of the equity side of climate change, right? That everybody that has a computer can have access to these resources, which is just really fundamental to what I would want to do and feel it's just like the least I can do. But then there are also people, obviously our profession is evolving, and 3D is becoming, so fundamental to how we work. We're, converting over to Revit and things like that. And so then thinking about other ways that we can make this easier for people that, might have a different workflow. Is this something that we're just now shows up in, whatever your 3D CAD or whatever platform that you're using. And so, I think that that's a possibility, and potentially teaming up with others too that are doing this, from an architecture standpoint. Is there something like a holistic tool that everybody can be using, and it's calculating the buildings, and it's calculating the landscape, and it's integrated into your 3D BIM model, and so there's definitely room for that. And it's just a question of like, what's going to make the most change, at the end of the day. I mean, again, I never thought I was going to be managing and dealing with an app. So it's not like, it's filling a gap for now, but I think there's definitely lots of ways. And again, I think that the interdisciplinary collaboration is so key to us being a part of the conversation too, that's happening at this global level.
Yeah, and I guess too, with that relationship and that connection, how do you see us as landscape architects needing to continue to not only increase our consulting with things such as climate positive design, but also communicating to other aspects of the AEC industry? How would you say that this tool can help that? Or I guess, are you seeing ways where maybe you can bring this into an architecture office and say, hey, this is what we're planning on doing? What tool are you, or what similar tool are you using?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone should, if they're not being asked, well, first just go. I think it's the best practice that we, ask first and say, this is what we believe in as a profession. This is what we're doing. What all are you doing? How are you measuring it? How can we sync up this data together and present it to our client holistically, just in the spirit of collaboration. And I think that's a good way to go about doing it. There's other ways, that we can be collaborating, speaking at conferences together and things like that, getting outside of our comfort zone and our wheelhouse, and just finding other like-minded professionals in other disciplines. There's probably, I'm guessing, for in schools where you have an opportunity to just get to know architecture students and engineering students, right? And making those relationships early on, and those are the people that are going to be the bosses like someday. So you build that network, and you can work, then you realize, oh, you're working with those friends that you made in college, and if they call you to work on a project with them. And so that always helps in the long term, if you're really passionate about something, to find kind of kindred spirits out there.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess too, kind of following along that same track, do you see this also being applied to agricultural systems? I know that you had shown a few projects where there were things like urban gardens and things like that, but do you see it used in maybe a broader agricultural sense?
I think it definitely has that potential, and I think there's a question of, is this the right tool for that? I mean, I think you can, in terms of scale, you're able to quantify it, or do we actually need something that's making more of like land use decisions? But I definitely think that there's a whole another conversation then about, well, actually, if we're growing our food on site and we're reducing the miles that your food has to go from where it's grown to you, that's a whole other aspect, right, of the carbon conversation. And so I think it's definitely on the list, to consider incorporating. And I think that, one interesting thing is, like, if there's something not in the app and you're looking for it, definitely reach out. There also is this challenge of reality that there's only so much data out there that exists in the world, and good scientifically verified data that we can actually use confidently. And so those that are interested in the science side of things, plant nerd like me, there's room out there, I think, for research to be done in those areas.
That's awesome. Cool. And then I guess for you, and your journey up to this point has been so incredible, with so many accolades and so many great projects. What do you see as the future for yourself in your career?
Oh my gosh, that's so hard. I don't know. I'll just be honest. I didn't know 5 years ago this is what I was going to be doing. Had no idea. And so maybe I'm intentionally not trying to figure that out. yet, because I just don't know where what's the world need? Like, what does the world need of landscape architects? Like, I'm always asking myself that. And I think it's just been guiding me along this path, this kind of unknown path. But I think that I really hope that as our profession evolves, that we evolve with that being kind of our key question, is that what does the world need of us with our skill sets, and how can we better serve the challenges and people and the ecosystems that are out there. And so I think I'm going to keep that one as a TBD, but I hope it's, making some sort of a difference.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much again for your time. There weren't any other questions asked in the chat, and thanks folks for sending those in. But Pamela, thank you so much for your time this evening, just sharing your story with us, sharing the tools that you've created with us. And we hope that we can, come together more and more as we look for more solutions as we face the climate challenges that face us not only today, but in the future. So thank you everybody for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Pamela. It has been such a pleasure for you to join us and all of the guests as well, even outside of all of our students. And hopefully someday we do get to meet in person, and you're always welcome here at CSU.
Definitely. Thank you all so much for having me. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.